Welcome to this special Australian Psychedelic Society explainer session, I suppose you'd call it. We wanted to bring together some people to talk about the recent handing down of an independent report by an independent group that was put together by the Therapeutic Goods Administration, the TGA, on a proposal to reschedule MDMA and psilocybin from Schedule 9 to Schedule 8. And we want to take this apart a little bit because it can be a bit confusing sometimes. What are all of these schedules? What does it mean if that scheduling does happen? Who would have access and who wouldn't? And where to if that doesn't go ahead? Maybe some of the issues with it as well. So I'd like to introduce our guest speakers. Sam Douglas, the President of Australian Psychedelic Society, also a philosopher, Dr. Sam Douglas. Simon Beck, who is from the Australian Psychedelic Society you're in Sydney, aren't you, Simon?
Coffs Harbour. He's in
New South Wales. And
Sydney chapter.
Dr. Stephen Bright from Edith Cowan University, but also the Vice President of PRISM, Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine. Okay, so first up, let's just talk about quickly the proposal that has been put forward. So this was a proposal to reschedule psilocybin and MDMA from Schedule 9 to Schedule 8. Can we just get a quick summary from whoever would like to summarise what's going on?
So by changing it adding an entry into Schedule 8. So it wasn't so much that it was taking it out of Schedule 9, but adding it into Schedule 8. So what that would mean is that that MDMA, for example, if it had a Schedule 8 entry as well as a Schedule 9 entry, means that it could be prescribed by an authorised prescriber, and the way in which that would occur would depend on the state you're in. A good example, I think, is medical cannabis. So cannabis remains a Schedule 9 plant, yet there is a Schedule 8 entry now, and so it can be prescribed.
And just quickly, Schedule 9, what does a Schedule 9 substance mean?
It means it's a prohibited substance, has no medical utility, can only be used in research, and so it's generally where we find all of the interesting and fun drugs. But it's important to recognise that there's a bunch of other schedules for prohibited and highly regulated poisons that are covered by the TGA as well. So there's unscheduled things like Panadol that you can buy from the pharmacy. Then there's Schedule 2 and 3, which you can get over the counter at the pharmacy or at the pharmacy. Schedule 4 is prescribed. Schedule 8 is controlled. Schedule 5, 6 and 7 are increasing levels of regulation over poison. And then Schedule 10 are poisons so dangerous that they can't be manufactured, supplied or played with at all.
That was a recent addition as well, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah. So Schedule 8 means controlled, so it means that it will be able to be used in medical settings, but in a very controlled and regulated sense.
Yeah, so I guess a similar example would be dexamphetamine. Dexamphetamine, which is essentially amphetamine at speed. Dexamphetamine is just one stereoisomer of amphetamine, and so only psychiatrists and pediatric doctors are able to prescribe dexamphetamine. It can't be just prescribed by a GP. So it's a controlled medicine.
So in terms of language that people are probably more familiar with, the terms decriminalization and legalization, can we get a quick summary of those terms from maybe either Sam or Simon?
Sure, Nick. I think there's a lot of confusion around these now because compared to a few years ago, there's a lot of sort of movement around changes in drug laws in places other than Australia, except possibly the ACT. So I think it's worth going back over them. When we're talking about decriminalisation, really broadly what we mean is that by some mechanism, being, in possession of usually a personal, whatever a personal amount of drugs is, it's no longer considered a criminal offence. Exactly what this entails is varied in different places, but basically it would be, like in Portugal where it's complex, but it becomes a fine and or sort of being directed towards sort of mandatory treatment or counselling, something along those lines. But the important bit of decriminalisation is that being caught with the personal amount of these drugs, or any drugs in Portugal, it's no longer a matter of sort of for the criminal courts.
Yep, and so maybe some examples. So here in Australia, we have had rescheduling of cannabis for medical purposes, and that's across Australia. But in the ACT, there has been a change in law in cannabis that allows people to grow plants. So is this decriminalisation or legalisation? Simon, could you just break that apart?
I'm not too sure about what the situation in ACT is there and whether it is a decriminalisation or a removal of the penalty for growing those plants or whether it's actually been legalised. But to my understanding, it sort of decriminalisation is something that can occur on a state-by-state basis without something needing to be rescheduled. Whereas legalisation, something would need to be moved out of a controlled schedule at a federal level. So I think what's happened in Canberra is a sort of decriminalisation model. Sam, Steve, do you know anything more about what's happening there specifically?
My take on the ACT is it's like a hybrid legalisation because it's no longer a criminal offence or it's not illegal in any way, shape or form to grow plants within a certain amount, to possess a certain amount of cannabis. But it's a pseudo-legalisation because it's illegal to even swap cannabis. So to get the seeds to grow the plants, you'd be breaking the law. So it's a really weird system that they've got there at the moment.
Yeah, perhaps the familiar example is the Netherlands, where many people believe that cannabis is legal in places like Amsterdam, where actually it is illegal to grow, to manufacture, to supply cannabis. So the way that all happens is technically illegal. It's a very strange sort of model. So though it happens, the legal model doesn't necessarily reflect what actually happens. So this is why it's a very confusing kind of area. The terms decriminalisation and legalisation can be used and often do get used interchangeably in different areas, referring to different things. But perhaps more in states in the US where there is legalisation of cannabis, where you can buy it from a store, where that store can have the cultivation, the cultivators can grow it without there being any supply issues. That's kind of true legalization. So what we're talking about here with the changing of the schedule is not any of that at all. What we're talking about is a very minor change that would allow for certain patients in very particular conditions to be able to access MDMA or psilocybin for those conditions. So what are the sorts of conditions that people would be able to access it under, or what sorts of what sorts of hurdles would prescribers have to jump over in order to prescribe those?
It would be determined by the TGA, from my understanding. I mean, the application requested use of MDMA for PTSD, psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, but they also listed a range of other conditions that it might be used for, including substance use disorder. But the way in which that is then regulated in terms of how people are able to prescribe the drug is determined by not only the TGA in the way that it lists the drug in question, but also, as we were saying, each state has a different approach. Each state, so in Western Australia, we have both the Misuse of Drugs Act, which is about the criminalisation of different drugs, and then we have the Poisons Act, which is about the regulation of medicines. And so each state has a different Poisons Act, which refers back to that TGA document, the Poisons. Not the Poisons Act, Poison Standard. So all of the, I think one thing COVID's shown us is that we are not, we're not one country. We are a bunch of states. And I think with drug policy, it really highlights this further. So the TGA makes a decision, but the way that rolls out is going to be dependent on each state and the way it amends its Poisons Act.
Yeah, and that goes to some of the complications between that sort of TGA being a federal regulator, and every state has legislation that usually pulls in what the TGA decisions are, but not always in the exact same way. Sometimes there are slight changes about what's going on. I believe over the past 10 years, almost every state and territory has amended their legislation to make sure that it pulls in automatically the standard that is set by the TGA. I should double check that, but I'm pretty sure that happened over the past 10 years. Thank you, Steve. But yes, there are difficulties then within the state. So let's maybe turn to the independent expert review panel, which is part of this process that the TGA has been going through for MDMA and psilocybin. They handed down their report at the end of September. PRISM, Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine, provided a reply to that report. Can you talk us through, what the independent review said and what PRISM says about that, Steve?
Well, I think the independent committee just provided some objective evidence. It doesn't really provide anything new in terms of information with regard to the toxicity of the substances and their potential therapeutic utility, but it also doesn't make any recommendations to the TGA. I guess being a little cynical, it doesn't. I don't think it really adds much to the TGA's process, and the TGA made an interim decision not to reschedule. They formed this independent committee of 3 people that went away, developed a report that reiterated and consolidated some of the information that the TGA were considering, makes no recommendation, and now in December the TGA, make their final decision, and I'm not sure that the decision is going to be swayed by that report.
And I mean, what of other agencies that are involved with this sort of decision making? Because it's not just the TGA. There are also other bodies that are involved with prescription medications, especially when it comes to doctors being worried about liability concerns and things like that. If something were to go wrong, they prefer to have the backing of these bodies to make sure that the insurance will cover them, that they're not going to get in trouble, et cetera, et cetera.
The AMA has come out saying that they don't support a change in the rescheduling, and that they perceive that this independent committee was established due to some sort of pressure that was put on the TGA subsequent to their interim decision. And so it's kind of a strange situation where you've got the TGA considering rescheduling a drug so that doctors could prescribe it, but doctors saying they don't want to be able to prescribe it.
The College of Psychiatrists as well, I think, released a report to the initial consideration the TGA were undertaking, and raised some concerns and didn't sound overly supportive of the idea that this is something that's ready to enter clinical practice in Australia yet either.
So, from the perspective of the Australian Psychedelic Society, which is not a body that's involved with medical or scientific processes, but is involved with the psychedelic community more at large, what's the sort of take on this process, Sam?
I think it's been confusing, to be honest. I think it really has. Different organisations have put a different spin on this. I think there's been a lot of people who've seen this as I think I've heard Simon phrase that any progress is good progress. It's arguable whether this constitutes whether this would constitute progress at all, depending on what you're aiming for. If you're aiming for, as we are, to not have people get in trouble with the police every time they go out and pick a few mushrooms, then yes, this is literally the smallest incremental step you could take, if it's a step at all. So, there is that, but also that it's just been really confusing for people, because people kind of think that a lot of people think that if there was this extra entry in Schedule 8, that somehow this would flow through into the penalties being lower, or, because it's not Schedule, it's not, well, it still is Schedule 9. And as someone has pointed out to me in the past, nothing ever really leaves Schedule 9. I don't think in the history of Australia, our schedules, nothing has ever left Schedule 9. You just get extra entries for, rather cynically, if there's a way to make money off of it with it not being Schedule 9, then you might get a lower entry at, 8 or maybe 4, if you're willing to put in the decades of work. So yeah, I think it has been, I think a process that's interesting but confusing. I mean, our position, APS position was, I guess, a pragmatic position on the rescheduling was sort of yes and. It's like, well, yes, obviously, obviously MDMA and psilocybin shouldn't be Schedule 9. So they absolutely moving towards something that helps therapeutic access is a good thing. But then also took the opportunity to spend quite a bit of time arguing for why they should both be much lower schedules and that people shouldn't be being thrown in jail for possessing them anymore. But I don't think that was really what the TGA wanted to hear. So, I wouldn't expect them to pay much attention to that. But, we put our arguments forward as best we could.
From the PRISM perspective, Steve?
I think the PRISM perspective is exactly the same, yes, and what we would like is some governance around how this might be rolled out in the mainstream and, flowing over to sort of the APS and that perspective. One of the points we raised was the Oregon model, where they've decriminalised psilocybin mushrooms and basically setting up, building it from the bottom up, a way to allow people to cultivate psilocybin mushrooms and administer them in a therapeutic setting. And to me, that's maybe not the gold standard, but it's the gold standard from my perspective of values, because it means that it cuts big pharma out of the picture, really. If you're not synthesizing psilocybin and you're using a mushroom product, then it's going to mean that it's creates a more equitable access to that. And I think this, going back over that point, in terms of the conflation between decriminalization, legalization, what's going on with this rescheduling process, I think, another good example of this conflation is that because the TGA's poison standard feeds into the Misuse of Drugs Acts in each state, as long as it stays in Schedule 9, it's always going to be, there will be criminal penalties associated with the possession of it outside of that use sanctioned by the TGA. So it sort of legalises this very small amount potentially of using it in a medical context, but it still remains a criminal offence outside of that context.
And Simon, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about maybe some of the concerns over, and this is, I know there's many concerns I see on forums, on Twitter, various different social media platforms over the kind of psilocybin that might be used in these medical settings and how that would be obtained. Because we're not talking about the psilocybin mushrooms, of which you can find information about on our website and EGA's website, and I'll put a link up for those. But yeah, it's we're not really talking about that. Can you talk to that, Simon?
Yeah, I think it's something people raise as an issue. From my perspective, I don't see a massive issue in whether it's pure synthetic psilocybin or, coming from the mushroom in terms of the likely clinical effect that it has for someone. But I do see a massive difference in, as Steve said, equitable access, the cost. Once you start talking about it being something that's TGA approved, the application cost to get a medicine approved by the TGA is huge. You are ruling out a lot of small players from the market and effectively turning it into a really big money game. That, I think, really does limit equitable and fair access, and seems a little preposterous for something that grows wild, all over the country, and that can be cultivated at low cost and, relatively easily by pretty much anyone. I think it would be a real shame to see it sort of gate kept behind those huge costs associated with TGA approval processes around medications, when arguments that you might make for sort of a pharmaceutical product that somebody's cooking at home in a, unsanctioned lab versus something that's made pharmaceutically, those arguments don't really apply when you're talking about mushrooms. They're safe. There are no surprises there. There is a far longer history of use with those than with anything coming out of any lab anywhere in the world. So I think the idea that you could ever argue they need to be synthesized in order to be safe is just ridiculous. Similarly, arguments around if it's not synthetic, you don't know the dose. Well, people manage quite easily with that. I think anybody who's had any exposure to this stuff could easily, as Steve basically has laughed that away. That's nonsense. So from my perspective, that's the biggest issue with whether we're talking about synthetic psilocybin or the mushrooms as a product.
And this is a broader issue than just psilocybin, because I should add that one of the issues of access to good class psychological treatment is a cost issue, and it's been brought up over the past couple of years that some of the best psychological clinics operate in some of the richest suburbs of cities across Australia, and that people who are in middle class or even lower classes just don't have the ability to access. In fact, I think the problem was that if you're in a significantly lower class, then there are ways that you can, socioeconomic, I should say, the amount of money that you have access to, then there are ways to access these things, because there are programs in place to be able to pay for some of that. But if you're just above that, then you're expected to be able to pay for these things yourself. So there's actually kind of a missing middle in psychological treatment. So in terms of access, money is a big issue, and it sounds like would we want to end up with a situation where psychedelic treatment is determined by which socioeconomic class you belong to?
Well, we wouldn't really. I mean, just to backtrack for a second, with one of Simon's points was that, and I know this is only about a few months old now, you can actually, in the US now, you can buy kits that allow you to test the strength of your mushrooms. Now, it's a thing. I don't, understand the whole process, but they're only a few months old. But yeah, I mean, that's right. The equity kind of issues around this. I mean, the cost of getting psychological sort of treatment, it's enough already as it is, and it just seeing a psychologist can cost a lot. You only get so many sort of sessions on a sort of standard treatment plan through a GP, and the more specialised help you need, potentially the more it ends up costing. When you need to see a clinical psychologist instead of a normal psychologist, when you need lots of sessions or a lot of ongoing treatment. Yeah, it really does rack up, and that's before anyone has actually prescribed you anything. And you can imagine that even if you could prescribe MDMA or psilocybin, it's going to cost a lot. It's not going to be on the PBS, so it's just before you pay a psychiatrist and or a clinical psychologist to sit with you for 8 hours while you've taken the dose. That's not going to be cheap. And then just the dose itself is also probably going to run to thousands of dollars too. So it's going to be expensive. You would probably be cheaper just to get on a plane and go to Costa Rica or the Netherlands and take some mushrooms there.
What a crazy place. I think just on that one. I guess being a little bit more optimistic in terms of our healthcare system, we do have a much better system than the US. And I think what we're describing here is a move toward that US system where everything's privatised and you have to pay for everything yourself. But we do have a really good public healthcare system in Australia. And I think for this to be mainstreamed and for it to be down-scheduled, the public mental health care services need to be trained up and being able to deliver this so that there is equitable access. I think something I've seen in my time as a psychologist, when I first started out as a psychologist, it was before better access. And so most people, except for very wealthy people, would access a psychologist through public mental health care services. And then they privatised the healthcare system by creating this better access. All the psychologists were either made redundant or saw the money in private practice and moved over. And so now we've got this weird hybrid model of a public healthcare system and a private healthcare system. And if we go down this path of rescheduling and only do it within the context of that private system, then it excludes many people from being able to access it. And so I really hope that when we do go down this pathway, that it's included within our public mental health care service.
Mm-hmm. It is an ongoing issue, and as Steve mentioned earlier, December is when we'll be finding out the next step in this particular process from the TGA. But also a reminder that there have been other applications in the past to reschedule psychedelics in a variety of ways. That's something that we will hope to cover and bring light to those sort of historical applications, because understanding what has been done before really helps to understand what sorts of issues were raised by the TGA at that time, who else out there might be an ally in the community to speak to, and what approaches do and don't work. So it's something that we will hope to cover more of in the future. Before we finish, some final thoughts from each of you.
Look, I'm not sure what's the right thing to say to wrap up on this. We don't know what the outcome's going to be, but I think what we can say for sure is we know what isn't going to happen if this change in scheduling occurs. And from our perspective, it's that literally nothing changes on the ground for people, either for people who, nothing's going to change for people who are using psychedelics outside of clinical settings. But in the short term, not a lot's going to change for people who would benefit from psychedelics in clinical settings.
I've got a cynical takeaway. While we very rarely see new sort of down scheduling, so cannabis is an example. Amyl nitrite was a really good example of where there was a change in scheduling. Being a bit cynical, the TGA are very good at putting things in Schedule 9. So if you find something out there that's missing and you send a letter to the TGA, you can be pretty much assured that they'll put things in Schedule 9. They just don't seem to like to take things out of Schedule 9 and are very cautious about putting things in other schedules.
And I agree very much with everything Sam said. I think it's really important to remember what won't change with the rescheduling into S8. But what I would really like to see moving forward, because I do totally see the need for clinical access to these things, I'd just love to see more open discussion around the plans to ensure that access is equitable and fair and across the board, and not sort of gatekept by cost.
Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media for more information and updates. And if you have any questions, you can also find our website, psychedelicsociety.org.au. Get in touch with us, join a chapter, or join the conversation. Thank you.